All right, great. So my webinar is on the importance of language in the classroom. And the book I read was Choice Words, How Our Language Affects Children's Learning by Peter H. Johnston. It's not a long book. I totally suggest it to anyone who's interested in learning more about language, how teachers should use language in the classroom. And this text is really about, as is written here, the conversational nature of instructional interactions and a guide on how to use instructional talk powerfully, which I think is awesome. And this text focuses on, quote, as Johnston quoted, things teachers say and don't say whose combined effect changes literary lives of their students. Wow. So just to start out, I just want to cover a few terms that I'll be using, and also, well, one term, and also Johnston's view of teaching and the classroom environment. More to the point, like what he would like teaching in the classroom to look like. So the first important term for you to understand is sense of agency, as you can see. And as Johnston states, if nothing else, children should leave school with a sense that if they act and act strategically, they can accomplish their goals. That's found on page 29 of the Kindle edition of this book. So I find this statement extremely powerful because it comments on the importance of a connection between what you do and what happens, the consequence, whether that be positive or negative. I don't want to use consequence negatively because I don't think that that's what he means. But Johnston describes the sense of agency as a fundamental human desire to have a connection between how you act and what occurs based upon your action. That understanding and this spark of agency, Johnston continues, and I quote, is the perception that the environment is responsive to our actions, end quote. As teachers, we have to point out to our students this connection between action and consequence, what happens, and instruct them that when we act strategically, as he stated, we can accomplish things. We can meet our goals and our expectations, especially in the sphere of learning. And this is critical learning, which is really wonderful. So how he views teaching in a classroom environment is really important, and he sees it as these points laid out for you. It's building a caring and respectful learning community where people feel valued, supported, and heard. And it also includes productive and critical learning. And I love that he says critical learning. He doesn't say critical thinking, because he believes that learning itself, every single thing that's under the umbrella of learning, should be critical. We should be asking questions. We should be delving deeper into our learning. I think that's wonderful. In addition, it's having a shared understanding of the situation or activity that you're engaged in with your students. You're creating that community. You're all engaged in it, and that doesn't have a room for a hierarchy. The teacher isn't this authoritarian who knows everything and must validate everything. It's you're all involved in this learning together. You're all engaged in this learning together. And lastly, the most important point that he likes to stress in teaching is that the intellectual life is fundamentally social. It is language. Johnston states, and I quote, intellectual environments that produce not mere technical competence, but caring, secure, actively literate human beings. And that's found on page 2. Conversation is important. It's, end quote, conversation is important and fundamental to the learning experience. So now that I've summarized those points, I'm just going to present some talk leads he suggests that foster student identity, this sense of agency that I discussed, and literacy through your language. They're your talk lead suggestions. And these talk leads are the strategies that I intend to use because they do all of the above. They create a sense of agency, they create identity, and they encourage and foster literacy. So moving on, the first strategy is noticing and naming. This strategy of noticing and naming is essential to, as Johnston poses, and I quote, normalize the practice of trying out new possibilities, end quote. You're normalizing the idea that different strategies you're unfamiliar with can be used. You can ask questions and notice successes. So, like I said, this includes noticing the positives of what the student does successfully. So let's say a student, as he suggests in the book, writes FO for farm. You capitalize on the F being right and repeat it so that you did this right, you did this successfully, so that they repeat it. He states doing something even partly right is still a launching pad for new learning. You're calling attention to their mental skills, and even the talk lead that's mentioned here, what kind of text is this? You're implying that there are other types of texts, not just this one, and then you're naming that type of text. You're having them name that type of text. So, wonderful strategy to use. The next strategy is the strategy of fostering identity. Your role as a teacher, he states, and I quote, is to offer them and nudge them towards productive identities. And that's found on page 23 of the Kindle edition. End quote. With these leads, you give the student a sense of responsibility and a serious role in their learning. You're calling them a poet. You're calling them a writer. You're calling them a reader. You're more closely, you're identifying them as a poet. You're identifying them as a writer. You're identifying them as a reader. So without a question, you're establishing them in this role. And so they're responsible for it. And with the talk lead, I bet you're proud of yourself. You are fostering their independence as a learner. They can be proud of their successes without your external praise. They can look to themselves for internal feelings, and those feelings relation to behavior and events. It's their internal motivation that they should be looking for, and you're also praising them at the same time because you're saying, I bet you are proud of yourself. You also are giving them the opportunity to plan as a writer with the talk lead. What are you going to do as a writer today? Knowing how to plan, or even having an idea how to plan, is really, really crucial to learning, to the learning process, and you're making that part of their identity right away. So my biggest takeaway is the topic of agency, the strategy of creating agency and becoming strategic. And he states this as, you're really teaching 4 strategies. You're not teaching just strategies. So he says you're requiring students to generate strategies and then having them review those strategies and retell those strategies. Evaluate those strategies and their effectiveness, so they're in control of the process, both problem solving wise, and they have the agency to do that. This is what he calls revealing, and it's basically arranging for a student to figure something out independently without full awareness and then reflecting on it, which is amazing. And then they have to articulate it, which is great. It's instruction without a hierarchy. You're not put above them. They're explaining their strategy to you. Another great point he makes is, the talk lead he makes is, what problems did you encounter today? You're normalizing you're making it normal to encounter problems and then talk about them and confront them and solve them, which is great. What can you do? It leads them to the conclusion that they can do something about their problem. They can solve it, which is great. Again, that's a form of planning, which is wonderful for them to be able to plan ahead. about what they want to do next. So my favorite quote and my biggest takeaway, other than that strategy, but my favorite quote was, if the children aren't making errors, they are not putting themselves in learning situations. As this states, errors are another gateway to learning and conversation. In fact, they are the most important gateway into looking beyond what you've achieved successfully and what you must do next. So this includes planning, this includes capitalizing on their successes, but it makes the fear of a mistake less so. It's an opportunity for learning, and that's something I think we should really encourage in our students, that encountering a problem is an opportunity to improve, and that's essential to learning improvement. So thanks for listening to my webinar. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and thank you very much.